From the Leagues of Women Voters of Akron area, Greater Cleveland, Hudson, and Kent, this is Real Talk. Thank you for taking the time to be with us on this evening. For those of you joining us and needing closed caption services, they are available. Follow the instructions seen here, highlighted with the arrow. We will leave that screen up for you for just a bit. Real Talk is a diversity, equity, and inclusion program hosted by the 4 Leagues of Women Voters in Northeast Ohio. Again, Akron, Greater Cleveland, Hudson, and Kent. The program addresses issues of discrimination, racism, oppression, and suppression across Northeast Ohio, touching on topics from education, health disparities, criminal justice, housing and employment insecurity, to environmental justice, injustices, and democracy. In this program, with the support of Fair Districts, we'll focus on democracy and hear about the upcoming changes in state political map redistricting as pertains to the choices many of us will make when we vote, who else they'll be speaking for when they serve in the legislature. State House and Senate representation may change, and later in the year, some of us will also see congressional seat shifts as well, with Ohio losing a spot in Washington because of shifting population nationally. Contributors to the event this evening include partners Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, and the ACLU of Ohio, along with the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission. We also would like to thank and credit the Akron NAACP, a longstanding friend and partner of the League and a prime builder of the program that we are presenting tonight, and the Freedom Bloc, which aims to educate the Black electorate and the broader Black community on issues of impact. I'm Rick Jackson, the senior host and producer at Ideastream Public Media, which includes broadcast outlets WVIZ PBS, 90.3 WCPN, and 104.9 WCLV. I'll be serving as your moderator for this evening. Make note that the resources we will be mentioning tonight will be emailed to registrants later, and that this session, like the previous, is being recorded. Enables you to go back as needed and kind of review what we'll learn here tonight. It'll post at realtalklwv.org. Now here's a preview of where we're going this next hour. Looking at the fight for maps to be fairer to people in these districts, why 2021 is so critical, what changes we as voters have now mandated be included in the drawing of the next border for the next decade, then leaving room for questions that you have or will formulate as we hear from the panelists. To bring us to part 1, the fight for fair maps, allow me to introduce Carrie Davis. She was once the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, leading the focus on voters' rights and redistricting. And let's applaud her success with Fair Districts of Ohio for the work done in the 2015 ballot issue. Carrie, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Rick. It is wonderful to be with all of you today. I feel like it's a great opportunity to visit with everyone back home in Ohio and talk about the next step in our very long journey to get Ohio to having fair maps. As many of you know, we've been at this for a long time, and I feel a little bit like the ghost of Christmas past with you this evening, as just to hit some highlights of how we got here. And seeing your name showing up in the chat, many of you were huge contributors to getting us here. So how do we really actualize this amazing win and this opportunity we have? So let's look real briefly at how we got to this reform. It was a long effort. We have a valuable opportunity to put that to work, but I think it's really important to recognize it took years of hard work by many advocates, organizers, and volunteers to get here. And I just want to give major props to everybody who was involved, because this really was an amazing community of organizers and activists who spoke up and got us to this point. So to give you an idea of how far back this goes, from 1978 to 2001, there was a redistricting reform constitutional amendment introduced in every single session of the General Assembly, and not a single one of them passed. In 2005, we had a ballot initiative that was put on by a group called Reform Ohio Now. It had a package of a bunch of different democracy reforms. And unfortunately, the controlling board split them up. So instead of having one package of democracy reforms on the ballot, voters were asked to vote on a bunch of them. And that confusion led to failure. And unfortunately, that package of reforms did not pass. The following year, once again, we had reform introduced in the legislature that didn't go anywhere. We thought we had the best opportunity in 2009 and 2010 ahead of the 2011 redistricting, because there had been this ongoing conversation. There had been attention on the ballot, attention in the legislature and in the press that hey, what we have really doesn't work for us. Maybe we need something better. And we got really, really close. So the Republican controlled Senate at the time and the Democratic controlled House at the time each passed reform to put on the ballot, but then they couldn't agree on which version to go forward. And ultimately we wound up with none. So then we all know what happened in 2011, because we're all living with the consequences of it right now. We had these horribly gerrymandered districts. We've got the snake along the lake connecting the western parts of Cleveland all the way around the lake to Toledo. At one point, there's not even land connecting the district, but a bridge over water. We have Summit County split into multiple districts, which makes it really hard for the community to have any political power and voice, and lots of other problems that you all know really, really well. At the same time in 2011 that this gerrymandering was happening, good government organizations formed the Ohio Campaign for Accountable Redistricting that ran a commission for citizens to draw maps. And I'll tell you this, every single map submitted to that competition scored better than what was ultimately passed. And that, of course, led to this greater call for reform. In 2012, the year after that awful gerrymander, there was another citizen initiative that was led to put on the ballot to reform Ohio's redistricting process and to have something similar to California with an independent redistricting commission. There was a very robust vote no campaign to try to defeat us on that reform effort that unfortunately succeeded. However, one important thing is all the folks who were pushing to vote that down didn't say that what we had worked. They acknowledged that, yes, we need reform, but they said that that wasn't the right reform. So to vote it down and we'll put forward something better. And in the aftermath of that, advocates really worked hard. So we had league members and Common Cause members and NAACP members and lots of good government-minded folks around the state, including some receptive legislators as well, who recognized we really needed reform. So at that point, we really shifted into this push for how do we get there? How do we make this reform real? In 2013, the year after the 2012 ballot issue failed, there were joint resolutions introduced in the legislature. But at that point, the focus really shifted. We had this thing called the Ohio Constitutional Modernization Commission that some of you may remember, that was looking at, are there parts of the Constitution that should be updated because they're out of date? And there were quite a few committee hearings and discussions looking at how we do redistricting and should that change. And I know many of you who are on this call today were probably in those rooms with us presenting testimony to the Modernization Commission to try to suggest reform. Now, ultimately, the commission, which did have members of the legislature from both parties on it, couldn't reach consensus. They kept churning their wheels, much like we saw in the legislature. However, two legislators, Representative Vernon Sykes, who's a Democrat from Summit County, and Representative Matt Huffman, who's a Republican from Lima, negotiated a compromise during the lame duck session at the very end of 2014. And this was like truly 11th hour. These were like going into the wee hours of the morning negotiations on the very last day of session. And these two legislators negotiated a compromise plan for how we redraw the General Assembly that overwhelmingly passed both chambers right before they adjourned the session. And that became issue one that was on the ballot in 2015. And you, of course, all know, and we'll get to this in a minute, that we have slightly different versions for how we redraw the General Assembly and Congress. This was part one, it was doing the General Assembly. And the same legislators who passed the bill on the state General Assembly, Sykes and Huffman, were the ones who were co-chairing that issue one campaign in 2015. But advocates knew that we couldn't just squeak by. We knew that we had to win that vote by an absolute landslide so that we could send a message that the people of Ohio demand fair maps, and to also give us some momentum for when we moved next into the call for congressional reform. So that's what gave birth to Fair Districts, that we had this Fair Districts campaign that many of you recall in 2015, because we wanted issue one to win by a landslide, and we did. It passed by 71.5%, which is huge. It won in every single county in the state. which is fantastic. And it sent a clear message. And on election night, when we were all at Campaign Central and we're getting ready to do our victory lap, when we did our press release that night saying, yes, we won, Ohio demands better, we immediately said, next we need to move to congressional and do congressional reform too. And in case you're wondering, the reason that was split up is because at the time that the legislature was considering that first reform, there was a case pending in the US Supreme Court on Arizona's Independent Redistricting Commission. And there was a question about whether they could legally change how congressional districts were redrawn. So the rationale given by the legislature for waiting on that second piece was because they were waiting to see what the US Supreme Court did. People speculated whether there were other reasons, but that's the one that they gave. So we ultimately ended up with it, but round one and round two. So what happened after that win was organize, organize, organize. That was our mantra for 2016. We were taking that win that we had on issue one and saying, we need to keep this going. And then y'all may remember there were some other things that happened in 2016. There was a major election that year that got some people fired up. And people were marching in the streets. People were engaged. They really wanted to do something to make democracy stronger. So in early 2017, the Fair Districts campaign launched an initiative petition for congressional districts to force the issue, to make sure that we were telling the legislature, in essence, if you're not going to push congressional redistricting reform, we will. And ultimately, that was an amazing grassroots effort that we had volunteers all over the state who pitched in and circulated petitions and carried this message and met with our local editorial boards and their local leaders. And ultimately, all that hard work paid off, because in 2018, there were negotiations then between legislators and Fair Districts campaign leaders that ultimately led to the passage of another resolution in the legislature to place congressional redistricting reform on the ballot in 2018. And that one too. And I think it's important to recognize how we got here, because there was a lot of work and we need to own those wins. And we need to carry those forward. So when we're advocating for fairer districts and how our community should be represented when the lines are redrawn this year, hold on to all that power and carry it with you, because we worked really hard to get here. And we've proven that the voters care and the voters win. So pay it forward. Thank you.
Carrie, thank you. I was taking notes here, thinking back to what you said about 2011. You said the maps submitted by people were all essentially better than what we got. That power you just mentioned that we have, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again?
Well, a big part of it is making sure that we're holding the map drawers accountable. So having public hearings is an important part of that, demanding that the map drawers show us how they're drawing these maps and that they're listening to public testimony, they're listening to what communities want and holding them accountable. The best thing that we can do is be engaged in this process.
Thank you. To take us now into the redistricting in 2021 area, we now have Greg Moore of the Citizens Redistricting Commission. Greg is co-chair of the organization. It launched back in May to hold public hearings in a wide range of communities. Those were held last week. They included stops in Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown, and Mansfield, along with 6 other cities. The commission seeks to engage marginalized communities, and Greg is one of more than a dozen commissioners. Good evening, sir. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Rick, and appreciate seeing so many champions on this call. I can't thank Carrie Davis enough. She is very modest, but she was a spearhead of this movement that took place over these years in the League of Women Voters and the NAACP and the ACLU. These are champion legacy organizations that did not give up the fight when it was tough. It took a lot of being knocked down and then getting back up. And that's exactly what we did as we helped with petitions and signed on to various campaigns over the years. So look, I now am the co-chair of the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission. That comes because of my many years of work on this area. Also president of the Promise of Democracy Foundation and the Ohio Voter Fund here in Ohio, but served 17 years as the NAACP National Voter Fund Director. So I bring to this work years and years of working in the area of voting rights and building coalition. So this work that we did has been connected to many of the things that we've done over the years. I'm co-chairing this with Kathleen Clyde, who is a former state representative and former candidate for Secretary of State. Kathleen and I met each other on the floor of the House in 2011, fighting a voter suppression bill, HR 194, another great champion campaign where we signed petitions across the state, got the ballot initiative prepared to actually overturn the legislature's voter suppression bills back in 2011, almost, I guess, 10 years ago. But like that time, as Carrie said, in 18, the legislature saw what was coming down the road and themselves repealed that bill. And just as they saw what happened in 2015 with that massive voter turnout, they got together. That movement that all the people on this call built helped create the circumstances for the second resolution to be passed in 2018. So that activism created where we are now. This meeting is being called on September 1st. It is really the first day in the Constitution that says we should have had this done by now. And we know that did not happen. The Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission began holding hearings in May of 2021. We didn't have data, we didn't have census information, but we did have people who were out there listening and waiting and expecting to play a role in this year because of the redistricting reforms that they knew they had passed in overwhelming margins. We had 9 virtual hearings. They were held in every region of the state, Northeast Ohio, Southeast Ohio, Southwest Ohio, Northwest Ohio, and Central Ohio. And through that process, we had every region of the state weigh in, and we learned some things from our hearings. The main thing we learned was that communities of interest include people of color who want and deserve their communities, their cities, and their townships to be held together and not gerrymandered. Over and over, participants said, as you've heard over and over again, that they want to be the ones who are choosing their representatives and not the other way around. So what else did we learn? That no matter what we look like or where we come from, when it comes to having our say in who represents us, people wanted the same things. They wanted a transparent process that we can trust. They want their communities to remain whole, and they wanted voters to have an equal voice. So this is the first time this week where we actually now have the first maps presented that have actually taken all the criteria set forth in the Constitution, all the federal and state laws that we know we have to abide by. And we produced a unity map, and others are producing maps that have not been gerrymandered, and they don't privilege any certain particular political majority or minority. The maps were drawn based on over 2,000 entrants of communities of interest who put in our portal their ideas and their mapping of what their communities were and why they were important to hold together. They were everyday Ohioans, Republicans and Democrats from all over the state. And they want these maps to last for 10 years. On my side, and many of you here, I know we want to make sure that African Americans, Black and Brown communities, the immigrant community throughout Northeast Ohio and throughout the state are included in this process. And we're happy that our hearings represented and our commission represents a broad cross-section of those voters who have been a part of this process. We're confident that the maps we presented will improve the overall environment in Northeast Ohio, as well as the state of Ohio, particularly in these communities that have not been heard or have been left without their voices being clear. I know you've heard it 1,000 times, but I want to say it 1,001 times. The reform passed in 88 counties. We're used in Ohio to things passing where 9 counties vote one way and 81 counties vote another, and 79 counties vote another way. And we take that as a majority. In this instance, all 88 counties voted for this. That means that African Americans, white, rural, urban, brown, socioeconomic groups across the state all said the same thing. We want to change this process. So this is not us telling the legislature, hey, this is what we want to do in Cleveland. This is us saying, hey, your township, your county voted for this, and you need to make sure that you're on board. So we're looking forward to the state of Ohio's Ohio Redistricting Commission to do that out. They had hearings last week over a 1 week period. Glad that finally happened. But today was the day where we should have been voting up or down on a map, and we're not. Instead, we were told yesterday, we'll get back to you between now and the default deadline of September 15th. And so to us, we did the hard work, we listened to voters, we put in the time, and when the data did come in, many people lost a lot of sleep between the 15th of October, 12th of August and September 1, making sure that data was crunched and put in place. So we believe it's possible to develop maps on a nonpartisan basis that bans gerrymandering. This reform is unique to Ohio now, but we hope that other states will pick it up. But our maps are realistic. They reflect how Ohioans actually voted. We believe that if Ohioans voted overall, if you take over the last 10 years of all the elections held in this past decade, 54% of those votes went Republican and 44% went for Democrats. To us, that means that that is a fair representation of the breakdown of the voters of Ohio, so that we're not in the situation where there's a super majority in the House and the super majority in the Senate. That's not the way Ohio voted. Ohio voted 54 to 44, and we believe 55 to 44 that should be represented. And our maps have represented that. Our criteria represents that. In fact, we have presented a plan, the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission, where at least 44 House Democratic seats out of 99 will be held, and 15 Democratic seats out of 33 should be a part of that map for representative fairness. The Ohioans want transparency we can trust, so we don't get involved with cracking or packing Black voters. We believe in fair representation. Our commission's map actually recommends 12 minority opportunity districts for the Ohio House and 4 minority opportunity districts for the Senate. And this is important because we believe that African Americans, people of color, Latino people, and people who are representative of our whole community can influence elections outside of places where their votes are concentrated. And so we believe that influence districts are just as important as majority minority districts. We believe in keeping communities together. So we followed all the rules set forth under the Constitution of preventing unnecessary splitting of counties, municipalities, and townships. We believe that we have some of the best minds working on this. Certainly the people on this call represent some of the best thinkers, but to us, equal population, representative fairness, minority representations being maximized, keeping communities together, and making sure we don't make the mistake of believing that somehow we have to protect incumbents, because that's not what this is about. This is about protecting our communities. And so we want everyone to realize that the work that we've done, as complicated as it is, can be simplified by voters who say, hey, this is us choosing our representatives, not just trying to preserve a position that's been there for a long time. So I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion, and I would love to talk more, but I want to make sure we hear from some of these other great voices tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Hey, I was watching the chat as you were talking there, and you were putting an emphasis on the power of the Black and brown community. And the chat was kind of saying beneath this, well, the hearings last week were really unfair to a lot of BIPOC people because of when they were held, where they were held. Sometimes working people couldn't get there. They're saying, why did you schedule when you scheduled? Because it cut out a lot of folks of color.
Well, we certainly didn't do that. That was the Ohio that was the Ohio Redistricting Commission, the formal commission that was set up in the Constitution. We were the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission, and like other states, we set up those with hearings that began on the 12th of May. They were all held at 6 o'clock. They were all virtual. There was no driving and looking for a place to park. We were still in the middle of a pandemic, of course, but we offered people the opportunity after hours to give testimony and had a portal for them to give us not only testimony, but actually their representation of what they thought the fair maps would look like.
So you too would have liked to have seen a little bit more broad opening for folks last week.
Yes, I mean, if you're back at work or you're back at school, the hearing in Cleveland State, which I did attend, was packed. They were bringing chairs in as we got in, but it was the first day of class at Cleveland State. It took us a half hour to find a place to park. It was extremely busy. I'm glad the people were there, but we could have done this in the evenings. We could have done this over several weeks, and they should be doing it now. There's 2 weeks left. We should still be having, there should still be hearings on the part of the Ohio Redistricting Commission to hear from voters across the state and to bring their maps forward and to have that discussion now.
Excellent. Thanks for clearing that up. It is odd the old districts were heavily gerrymandered, creating election nights that left us no chance of surprise as the doors swung toward one party or the other pretty much by choice. Work of the ballot issues several years back brought change. It brought legal requirements. Here to explain how we hope the gerrymandering has been reduced, if not eliminated, Collin Marozzi. He's a policy analyst with our friends at the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio. At the ACLU, Collin's principally focused on enacting criminal justice reforms, ensuring protection for the LGBTQ community, and he spent time working in the legislature as a senior aide at one time to Vernon Sykes in the state Senate. Collin, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Rick, and thank you to all the wonderful panelists here joining in, especially thank you to the audience for being here on just an absolutely critical issue. Redistricting, I love to use the phrase, we are literally shaping our future through drawing these new districts. So it's wonderful to see so many engaged individuals paying attention and really putting in the work to make sure we get this right. Now I have a couple of slides. So Carol, if you could pull those up, thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit today about what are the requirements that are in our new Ohio constitutional amendments, Article 11 and Article 19, that have to do with the redistricting of our General Assembly and Congressional District maps. And oddly enough, the first thing I want to start off with is what is actually not a requirement in our redistricting process. And that is the very confrontational and very odd looking district that is Congressional District 11. We are all very familiar with Congressional District 11 as it has been gerrymandered this past decade to include most of the city of Cleveland and the eastern portion of Cuyahoga County, and then jutting down I-77 down to the inner city of Akron in order to round up more votes to complete that district. I wanted to say that Ohio is not required to have what's called a majority minority district. And what that is essentially a congressional district that has a over 50% threshold of minority voters in that. And the reason there are majority minority districts is to combat the practice that happened across our country of white legislatures essentially drawing out and diluting the voting strength of our African-American voters. And I want to say that it's imperative that people know that Ohio does not have a mandate to create a majority minority district. And the reason for that is explained in a very famous Supreme Court case. It's called Thornburg v. Jingles, and that was decided in 1986. And that Supreme Court case essentially laid out three criteria that must be met in order for a majority minority district to be ordered and be forced to be created in order to protect voting strength of minority communities. And those three criteria are as follows. One, the minority population is in a close enough geographic location to where it can functionally serve as a single district. Now, African-American voters in Cleveland meet that criteria. They also have to vote in a block, in a racial voting block. So a large proportion of the minority voters have to vote in a certain way, in a single block. The voters in Cleveland check that box as well. But the box that they don't check, and this is the tipping point here, is that it has to be racially polarized voting. So the African American voting bloc votes one way, and the white voting bloc votes in a bloc the other way. And in this scenario, that would result in the creation of a majority minority district. There would be enough white voters that would be able to overcome the voting power of African Americans, and thus not allowing African Americans to elect a candidate of their choice. That does not happen in Cuyahoga County and in Congressional District 11. We know this because, according to American Community Survey data and census data, the demographic population of the 11th Congressional District is roughly 53% African American. So there is a majority of voters in that district that are Black or African American. However, Marcia Fudge, over the past decade, has consistently won the 11th Congressional District with upwards of 75% of the vote. Often, I think 1 or 2 elections, I'm not sure which ones in particular, she tipped over 80%. So that shows a willingness, and a sizable willingness, of white voters in Cuyahoga County to do what's called crossover voting, which is to cast their vote for the Black preferred candidate. And that is why Ohio and Cuyahoga County does not have the mandate of requiring a majority minority district. Now, the really perverse thing is in 2010, 2011, when this map was drawn, and we know this because of sworn testimony in our 2018 lawsuit challenging the legitimacy of our congressional maps, map makers use the Voting Rights Act as justification for the creation of the current Senate district, or Congressional District 11. They said that they had to extend down into Akron to collect and incorporate more African-American voters in order to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And that is just not the case. They did so because it allowed them to pack as many African-American voters into a single district as possible. Now, we know packing and cracking, are the telltale signs of gerrymandering. And unlike down in Cincinnati, where Congressional Districts 1 and 2 essentially split the city of Cincinnati and its African-American vote in half, in Northeast Ohio, they packed them all into Congressional District 11 in order to limit their ability to elect candidates of their preference outside of the single electoral district. Lisa Handley, who was an expert witness in our lawsuit in 2018, did a factor analysis on Congressional District 11. And she found that in order for a minority candidate and minority voters to have an opportunity to elect their own candidates and their preferred candidates, Congressional District 11 actually only needs roughly 45% African-American voters in order to meet that threshold of them being able to elect a candidate of their choosing. So I wanted to make sure everybody knows that though you'll hear folks talk about the Voting Rights Act and the requirements for Northeast Ohio, we need to reiterate that, first of all, it's not true. We do not have a requirement to create a majority minority district. And I also want to put some people at ease saying, well, if there's no mandate, then why won't, can we expect them to, crack apart Cleveland and to, dilute the African-American voting strength that way? And no, they cannot, because under the new rules established in 2018 and for the Congressional District redistricting process, there's a requirement that they keep large cities whole, Cleveland being one of them. So there are protections in place to give African-American and minority voters an opportunity district in Northeast Ohio without having to suffer under a packed district that really, takes away the voting strength and dilutes the voting abilities of our African-American voters. So that was the first thing I wanted to cover. Carol, next slide, please. And now I want to switch to our General Assembly maps, and I'll be quicker on these two topics. But we see here Senate District 24, which is the horseshoe district that encapsulates the city of Cleveland, and it works around the Cuyahoga County border. This district arguably is in violation of one of the most critical protections that were passed in 2015 as a part of the General Assembly redistricting reform effort. And that is, it's a provision in Section 6 of that article, Section 6C, which says that all districts shall be compact. And we see here, this is obviously not a compact district. You know, I actually Google mapped it and I traced and tracked it, and it takes 2 hours to get from Bay Village all the way to Mayfield if you're taking a route throughout the district. So having a district that is not compact, that it is sprawling and it weaves in and out of communities, that is a common tactic that map drawers have used across the country to pick and choose, to slither and slice through communities and through neighborhoods, and to pick their voters out and to make sure that they get a desired outcome. That was why it was one of the most critical components included in the 2015 reform measure. And just in case, Section 6 is one of the most critical measures of that reform, because it includes 3 provisions: making sure that a General Assembly map does not favor one political party over another. It says that the proportional representation in the General Assembly must match Ohio's statewide partisan vote totals over the last 10 years. And it says they districts need to be compact in Section 6C. So to say that the 24th Senate District is a violation is not a far stretch. And I think it can reasonably be asserted that. Now, what does a more compact district look like? Well, there are a lot of options. However, one would think that you would try to maintain as many communities of interest as possible. So you would probably, instead of horseshoeing all the way around the county, you would extend more to the, with the southern and eastern suburbs of Cuyahoga County, and then into possibly the, again, more affluent, more have more similar communities of interest of Western Lake County and along the shores of Lake Erie. And then Carol, last slide, please. Thank you. And then this was a particularly interesting Ohio House district that I wanted to bring up, because it illustrates another critical reform that was passed in our congressional map process, which is it limits and it constrains the number of counties that can be split in Ohio, and it limits the number of times an individual county can be split. So I want to encourage everybody who's listening and participating in this panel to, when you have some downtime, go to statisticalatlas.com and you search for Ohio House District 38. It's really a marvelous tool. In this House district, there are portions that are part of the 7th Congressional District, the 11th Congressional District, the 13th, 14th, and 16th Congressional Districts, all dip into Ohio House District 38. Which is just an alarming number of, of districts when you think that one congressional district is roughly 7 times the size of a Ohio House of Representatives district. However, there are 5 different congressional districts, each taking and stealing their own chunk from one House district. So it really talks about how our previous map was created out of splitting communities, cracking counties, and making sure that the right amount of voters were in the right amount of districts. And one of the fundamental issues with this district is that the northern portion, that's included all of Summit County, that is split into 4 congressional districts. In the new reforms, one county can only be split up to 2 separate times. So we would see that change for Summit County. We would also see a change for Cuyahoga County, which is also split between 4 congressional districts. But we'd even also see that reflected in Stark County, which is split between 3 congressional districts. So the point of all these reforms and all these legal requirements are really to kind of handcuff the map drawers and constrain them to not repeat the gerrymandered map and maps for General Assembly and Congressional that they did back in 2010. So again, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Colin. I will hold some questions for you until we get to the Q&A, get us back on time here, but thank you. Great presentation. So we're finally about to hear what we don't have yet, and that's new maps for Ohio. Here from Common Cause Ohio to walk us through what we want is Mia Lewis, the Associate Director of Common Cause. She was involved in the anti-gerrymandering issue back in 2018, and yes, that was she offering testimony to the House Oversight Committee 2 months ago, opposing Senate Bill 80, but that's a different show. Mia, what do you have for us this evening?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And Colin, I was just going to say, someone was asking for that website. If you want to pop that in the chat, that sounded really interesting. So Colin's told us what we can't do and what's changed. And I want to look forward a little bit and see what we might be able to do. So this is a Senate map, Ohio Senate District map that's current. If you go to the next slide, what I want to do is show you a demonstration map. It's not a perfect map. It's not our favorite map or our suggested map, our proposed map. It's just something that's possible and that's legal, just to give you, just to keep you, thinking and get you started talking about some things and to think about some of the trade-offs that the map makers have to make when they're actually drawing new districts. So in this, there are many ways that maps can be drawn. This particular map is focused on keeping school districts together. So all the school districts are kept together here. Each district falls within the acceptable population range for Ohio Senate districts. The districts are contiguous. And the counties are kept intact as much as possible. Now you'll notice that District 6 looks very strange, but actually that is Cleveland. That is the outline of the city of Cleveland, which is not to be divided. So that's why that looks like that. District 5 doesn't look very compact. But one thing to consider is that actually what it does is it attempts to keep communities of interest together. And what it does is it keeps the inner ring suburbs, which are racially diverse and have similar economic interests and challenges, it keeps them together. And that's true both in the northern part of that district and in the southern part. And so that's actually a good thing to see in a map. Again, this is not a perfect map or what we're proposing, but it's something to get you thinking. And if you go to the next slide, this is actually the same map, but it's out a little bit further. And you can see the racial breakdown of these districts that are listed here. And you'll see that both Districts 5 and District 6 are what we would call majority opportunity districts. They're not technically, they're not technically minority districts. As Collin was saying, we're not looking for a district where you pack all the minority votes together and then those votes are wasted. And we're not looking for districts that are cracked apart with all the different minority votes in different districts so they have no power. But if you get up to 45, something like that %, then we're, we know that those are districts where voters of color will be able to have their voice and elect somebody who can speak for them in a way that's a benefit in a map. Okay, so next slide. This, of course, is our current U.S. congressional map with Cuyahoga and Summit divided 4 times each, and Portage and Stark also divided 3 times. And if you go to the next slide, this is Cuyahoga. It's just completely egregious. So instead of this, let me show you 2 again, possible legal maps, not something that we're saying is the best, but just a demonstration. If you go to the next slide, both of these maps, number 1 and number 2, fall within the allowable population range. They're contiguous. They all pass in terms of compactness. And the blue district in each includes Cleveland, which is not allowed to be split, and it provides a majority minority district. So that's something that's good about both maps. Now, looking at map 1, it focuses on keeping counties together, and that's a proxy for keeping communities together. This map really focuses on keeping communities of interest together. Oh, that is actually one thing that I forgot to say about the Senate map is that in one of those districts, District 7, it actually manages to keep the West Shore Council of Governments communities together, which might be a little bit tricky, but it does manage to do that. So that's keeping communities of interest together is something that has been prioritized for the person who's made these maps. So in map number 1 here, again, the inner ring suburbs are grouped together with a portion of Cleveland, which is appropriate because they're bedroom communities with close ties to Cleveland, in particular to University Hospitals, Cleveland Clinic, and University Circle. Many residents in the inner ring suburbs work in Cleveland. And so this is something that's been prioritized and is beneficial. If you look over at map 2, in map 1, Cuyahoga County has been split only once into 2 different congressional districts. In map 2, it's been split twice. And so it contains 1 whole and 2 partial congressional districts. And it's actually an example in some ways of what not to do if you're trying to keep communities of interest together. Because in this map, both on the east side and on the west side, those inner ring suburbs have been peeled off. They've been put into districts which are predominantly in more rural areas. And I'm actually going to quote somebody who took a look at these maps, who's a resident of Shaker Heights, what her reaction to map 2 is. She says, as a resident of Shaker Heights, I feel closer to the Cleveland community than to the far eastern suburbs that map 2 would put me in. Inner ring suburbs have inner ring issues that are not shared by the suburbs farther out. Also, inner ring suburbs are racially diverse and the exurbs are not. So this is just a really nice example of 2 possible legal maps. One is keeping communities of interest together and one is not doing that as well. So something to think about. Now, if you go to the next slide, I've also been asked to talk about, what's happening, what's next. And a lot is happening and there's a lot coming up and it's going to come up. It's a little bit of a fire hose situation and we need all of you to be kind of paying attention and helping us out here, because this is where, this is where we get to actually, everything that Carrie talked about, all those reforms, everything that we did, this is where we have to make it really happen. So with today passing September 1st, without a map being proposed, we're in uncharted territory. We don't have a map to look at. We don't have a schedule. We don't have a plan. So the first thing we're asking you to do is to take action. I'm sure Michael's going to pop that in the chat, to demand a schedule and to demand a schedule for maps to be proposed and for hearings. If the Ohio Redistricting Commission were a standing committee, it would have a regular time that it met. Tuesdays in the morning or Thursdays or something. And we don't have that. And when we have absolutely no idea when hearings are going to be, when they give us the absolute minimum 24-hour notice before a hearing is called, that's not really enough time for people to, get childcare, get off work, figure out a carpool, whatever it is. So there's many reasons why we need to know when these hearings are going to be. This is a really important thing. This happens once every 10 years. And we've been saying this since April. And as Greg said, the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission managed to hear from people. Why can't, and they had a schedule and they said what was going to happen. Why can't our official commission do the same thing? So in any case, whenever you hear, keep your ears out. When you hear there's going to be a hearing, when you see that there's a map proposed, take a look as quickly as you can. Look at all the fair districts and other advocacy groups are going to be analyzing those maps and saying what they think of them, but also look at them yourselves, because you are the expert about your own community. You can look at that map and think of the community map that you drew and say, you know what, this doesn't work for me. I don't like how my community has been put in this other area. That's really important as well. Be ready to attend the public hearings and to present testimony on proposed maps. And I have something important to say about the hearings. We know that when the Ohio Redistricting Commission, the official commission, formally presents a map, that triggers their own rules and rules in the Constitution that say there have to be 3 public hearings. But until they actually formally submit a map, they aren't required to give us any hearings. So the maps, for example, that the Democrats submitted yesterday, that was not formally introduced by the commission. The maps, the unity maps that Greg's commission proposed, that was not formally introduced. So we're just kind of hanging in the air until the commission itself formally proposes a map. Once they do that, then we know there have to be 3 public hearings before those maps are voted on. And what I want to say is, unless the public can meaningfully participate, unless we know when the hearings are going to be, then they're basically skirting the rules in the new reforms, which say that there has to be meaningful public participation, transparency and public participation. That's why we need to know when these hearings are going to be. So many people testified last week, and we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And the press was fantastic, and it was great. And we don't want it to end there. We want you to take your testimony and turn it into a letter to the editor. There were hundreds of people that submitted testimony. Please take those, turn them into a letter to the editor. If you didn't submit testimony, you can still write a letter to the editor about what you care about, why the lines are important to you, how they're drawn. And when we do finally get maps, lobby your representative and your senator whether to vote for or against those maps. That's going to be really important. And then there's a really important event that's coming up on September 21st. That is Fair Maps Day. And everyone on the Fair Districts team is working together. In fact, all the advocacy groups about this are working together. We're trying to get folks from every single corner of Ohio. Right now we have registrations. We have 250 registrations from 33 out of 88 counties. We'd love to get more counties represented. We want everybody there. Basically saying every county in Ohio cares about fair maps. This is not just an urban thing. This is not just a Democrat thing or a Republican thing. This is everybody in Ohio. So please join us then. And my last thing I want to say is, yes, we're upset that this deadline was missed today, but it's more important that we have a transparent process and we end up with fair maps than it is that we get a map on September 1st or September whatever. We want good maps. And that's it. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mia. You said a lot there. Folks, now it's your turn. We have all the panelists here. They're all hot right now. Questions can be directed by you. I may choose someone to answer a topic. I may choose more than one person to answer a topic. If perhaps you joined us late, let me walk through who we have again. Guest are Carrie Davis, former executive director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, Greg Moore of the Promise of Democracy Foundation and the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission, Collin Marozzi of the ACLU, he's a policy analyst there, and Mia Lewis, Associate Director of Common Cause Ohio, who you just heard from. Collin, I'm going to throw the first question at you. Came in from somebody that wanted to know about Senate President Matt Huffman raising a constitutional issue arising from the fact that the Ohio Constitution provides that state senators serve in 4-year terms, and they also must reside in their districts. So half the Senate will still be in office once we put these new maps into play. He's saying, do the new people drawing the maps have to take that into account, or are we going to have senators who have to walk away from their jobs because suddenly they don't live in the district they represent? What's the rule?
Well, let's just back up for a second and say, for those of you who may be unaware, on Friday, Dick Gunther, he's a professor emeritus at Ohio State, he gave testimony to the Ohio Redistricting Commission in Mansfield. And in his testimony, he said, as somebody who worked as a negotiator on the 2015 reforms, that incumbency protection was specifically identified as something that needs to be removed because, and Rick, this gets right to the heart of the question, if you have to protect incumbency, you essentially cement the entirety of the last decade's gerrymandered map, because with incumbency, coupled with the nesting rule, which requires 3 House districts to be wholly contained within 1 Senate district, you can't have a change of districts. So to blindly adhere to incumbency protection when there's no specific requirement for it in the Ohio Constitution is misguided. And I think this just calls for why we need to have a more robust public hearing schedule, because frankly, I would like to know what President Huffman was referring to when he mentioned a 1967 clause in our Constitution that also has to deal with protecting incumbency. So I don't really know what he was thinking, but I can tell you that Section 5, what it actually says is that when 2 senators are drawn into a single district, the senator that has the highest population from his previous district that is now incorporated in the new one will serve as the incumbent. And there's a clause also included in Section 5 that says if there's a conflict, that needs to be detailed and included in the General Assembly plan. So there's a process for determining it. And there's also a valve in which the map drawers can explain who will and will not be the incumbent. So I look forward to future public hearings where we get to hear President Huffman, talk at greater length on this proposed incumbency requirement. But as my reading of Section 5 is, that it does not disqualify any map for simply not protecting incumbents.
Thank you. Mia, question here. What are the odds that we're able to get maps that deliver on proportional representation?
Well, I think you're talking about sort of representational fairness, a map that accurately reflects kind of how Ohioans really vote. It's a really good question. I mean, I think it is a requirement of our legislative maps. It's not a requirement in our congressional maps. It is a requirement in our Ohio House and Senate maps. And certainly the maps that have been proposed so far have been able to do that. So we know that it is something that is possible to do. It's interesting to say that Ohio is the only state so far that has such a requirement. It's a little bit of a, it's a tricky thing because you have to figure out, well, how are we going to count how people voted? And that's something that we're, really curious about. So we're looking at how people voted over the last 10 years, but we don't actually know what partisan indexing that's called, what partisan indexing the Ohio Redistricting Commission is going to use, because they haven't told us that. So that's something that we're waiting for. Of course, I mean, it's important to say that if any of the maps that are proposed and that are voted on don't meet the requirements of the Constitution, of course, we always have recourse to the courts if we're being basically given a map that doesn't meet the rules. Then of course somebody will take it to the courts.
Thank you. Carrie, a question. How do we appeal to legislators who are afraid of losing their jobs if they do make a map that's fair?
That is the age-old question that we have been dealing with for
Yes.
decades, I'm afraid. And part of it is reminding the legislature that they were involved in making these reforms real. This wasn't done. The reforms we have were not done by a citizen ballot initiative. This was done because the legislature came together and put forward these compromise reforms that we have today. So part of it is reminding them that they had a voice in crafting a reform that they thought would be fairer to them. But secondly, I mean, this comes down to democracy. This comes down to letting the voters decide who represents them. And what it means is that they're going to have to get to know their constituents. The plus side to that is it's going to be easier for them to get to know their constituents because they'll have more compact districts with whole communities within them, which from a representation standpoint, not only is that better for the community if you have one rep instead of 4, but it also is going to make it a lot easier for the legislator because they actually know their district better. They have the opportunity to get to know their district and its needs much better if it's compact and made up of whole communities. So it's really talking about the benefits of what this new process gives us from their perspective as well as ours.
Thank you. Greg, small question with a big answer possibly. Wanted to know about population deviations that districts can have. Is it 10%? Is it 5%? How much bigger could one district be than the one next door?
I think the deviation is 5%, if I'm not mistaken. And that gives us a little wiggle room to make the seats compact, but also representative. So that's an easy answer. Could I just say one thing?
Please.
The previous question, the easiest way to make sure we don't have to go to litigation is to follow the Constitution. The easiest way to make sure you can get reelected is to represent the people who are in the constitutionally created district that you now want to represent. It's not about protecting their job, it's protecting the rights of the voters to have their say. So this is the mindset that we have fought for and had to change. So that old way of thinking about how we write our districts up is over. The new Constitution that we all voted for, or many people voted for, over 71%, says this is the way it is now in place. So the only thing that was unconstitutional yesterday, going back to what Senator Huffman said, was that they didn't have a map that had been negotiated with the Democrats and Republicans. And now we're on September 1st. We have another window between now and September 15th. The people of this state have a chance to say, I don't like this map, that map, may not even like the map that the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission put out. They were put out for the purpose of getting the dialogue among the voters. So what Mia said, going to those hearings, packing them, making sure people know their voices are heard is the most important thing we can do. And we don't get to do it in 2 weeks or 2 months or even 2 years from now. We can't do it again until 2030. So this is our window to make this happen. And this is the next 60 days of action that we really need to pay attention to.
Thank you. Mia, I know that you popped up maps that were just examples. We had somebody who wrote in right away and say, when I look at that, I see Stark County separated from Trumbull and Mahoning, and those people really want to be together. Are we going to see that multiplied 50, 60 times across the state with people who object to the maps to the point where we can't come up with any kind of consensus?
Well, I think that, of course, people won't be, happy. You're not going to make everybody happy, just like in an election, there are winners and there are losers. But if you have maps that are more compact and that keep communities of interest together, at least you're starting out in the right place. There are places where there are lines that are going to have to be drawn, and we're going to have to figure out where to draw those lines. But if, a lot of work has been done by a lot of people around the state drawing community maps of their neighborhoods, and, the commissioners, the official commissioners, a lot of maps are being submitted. They have an opportunity to look and see what people want, and, they can put their very clever heads together and draw maps that are constitutional and that do the absolute best to keep communities together in the way that makes, at least not everybody, but a lot of people very happy.
Thank you. Collin, we've got a lot of legal questions here. People wondering about actions available if there seems to be a gerrymandered GOP favoring map that passes the House, but just for 4 years because it doesn't have Democratic support. What happens there if it violates compactness rules, division rules? Somebody else asking about litigation in the courts. Talk to me about the legalities of what we're facing.
Well, I think it all comes down to, the totality of the circumstances. I think, obviously included in both reform measures was granting the Ohio Supreme Court original jurisdiction so that they would be the first court to hear any issue of redress. I think when it comes down to, are people going to sue? Is there going to be a lawsuit? What violates it? I think that, it's good to always be prepared, but we should not be resting on trying to fall back on and let the courts save us through this process. We need to activate ourselves right now. As Greg was saying, this is the 14-day window from now until September 15th. We don't want to leave it up to the interpretation of a clause through, through litigation and through legal argument. We, the people of Ohio, demanded these changes, and now is the time that we need to exercise our political power, we the people, and make sure that that happens. Now, obviously, if there are, if there's a gerrymandered map that only goes through for 4 years, there are provisions that allow for litigation to correct that. But I don't want anybody here to think that, we can just tune out and wait for the courts to save us on this. We need to make sure that we are engaged 100% throughout this entire process and make sure it doesn't even come to that.
Hey, while we're thinking about this though, what if we, and that's a colloquial we, what if we fail and we have to go to the 4-year temporary map? Does it have to follow all the same rules that the 10-year would?
Are you asking me, Rick?
I was, yeah, you're my legal guy.
So the 4-year map, there actually is a heightened level of scrutiny for a 4-year map in terms of they have to put in writing for the first time ever the decisions that they made in terms of being able to comply or not being able to comply for, for the sake of drawing a map. And that kind of reverts back to if there's any potential litigation on the subject, those explanations, those written findings that the map makers will have to provide if the 4-year map is what is enacted, That can all be used when, when people are evaluating the decision-making process. But for a 4-year map, the criteria in terms of fairness and proportionality, they do kick into a higher degree.
Greg, right now, there's been no sharing across the aisle with whatever maps that they're making, wherever they're making them. That's got to be concerning to you. And how do we get that to push sooner rather than closer to September 15th?
Well, I think if the commission functions as a commission and share maps, share ideas, share concerns, and do that publicly, transparently, I think we would get to a point where they can say, well, we have come up with the map. Now, if you're organizing to fail, you're not going to get that. If you're organizing to win, if you're organizing to comply with the Constitution, you can get there. The reason these maps that we dropped and other groups have dropped and the Democrats dropped, it proved that it can be done. There was a delay in the census data, but that was overcome by long, hard hours of work that was put in. The things that Collin is saying, and Mia and Carrie, who also has a great legal mind and has fought these battles, is that the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, all these groups have been doing this, have run the traps through a lot of this. And so what I think you'll find is that their maps won't deviate very far from the ones that follow the Constitution. There's only a certain amount of ways you can get 54 and 55 to 44 splits. And that comes down to the way that the state is divided racially, by rural, by counties, and by townships. So you can get there, but you have to walk into the meeting with the belief that we have to get this done to get a 10-year map. A 4-year map is just basically a delay tactic to prevent you from doing what the Constitution says you should really do.
Greg, you started that whole thing with the word if. Is that a lack of confidence or just realistic?
Well, I saw what happened yesterday. And, oh, wow, there's a constitutional deadline tomorrow. I guess we're not ready. And that was concerning to me because we all knew that date was coming and we all knew what we had to do over the last 3 months to get there. So now we have a 2-week window. So I hope between now and the 15th, so that if, Rick, I think it's me saying it can be done between now and the 15th. It means going to real hearings, having 3 hearings across the state, allowing people to come in and then coming to the conclusion that representative fairness means representative fairness. It doesn't mean let's try to find a way to avoid doing this for 4 years.
Okay, thank you all. Here to tell us now how to take some action on what we've heard is Catherine LaCroix, adjunct professor at Case Western Reserve University. Catherine, you're talking about redistricting competition as well.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Now you've heard, and thank you to our excellent speakers for their expertise and their passion for this process of legislative redistricting. So Mia did a great job of listing take action items for all of us. We had 2 that we wanted to highlight at the end of this particular evening. The first take action is actually not the one that's on your slide. Events are moving so quickly that our updated request will be found in the chat, because after the hearing yesterday, as Mia explained, it became pretty clear that the commission was dragging its feet and we need to demand a schedule of when they will release a map, and we need advance notice of hearings so that advocates can prepare testimony. So in the chat is a link for you to send a message demanding that the commission set a schedule for introducing maps and seeking public comment. So if you click on that, that's our first and easiest and most urgent take action. The second take action is for those of you who love map making, which I hope is lots of us. This is Enter the Fair District Map Making Competition. The best way to show what a fair map looks like is to draw one. So instead of reacting to whatever the decision makers produce, or even the advocacy groups, you might have views about it, as the chat has already shown. Show them how to do their job better. Enter the Fair Districts Map Making Competition. If you go look at the Fair Districts Ohio website, and there's a link in the chat, you will learn it's step-by-step outlined for you. Enter the competition, design your map, do it with a friend, but remember, time is tight. The deadline for the state competition is September 6th. For Congress, we have a little more time. There are cash prizes, but I would like to say that a fair map is priceless. Okay. And our third take action is just, you heard a lot tonight. To reinforce what you heard, visit the Fair Districts Ohio website, and especially the Takes Action page and the event page, and you'll learn a lot about what you can do. So I want to thank very important people who made this event possible, the 4 local leagues that together make up Real Talk, the leagues of Akron, Greater Cleveland, Hudson, and Kent. Together, we are all part of the League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan membership organization that works through state and local chapters to promote voting and protect democracy. People of any gender are welcome to join us in our work. I'd like to thank our partner organizations who are listed on your screen, and you can learn more about them by looking at their websites. Thanks again to our expert panelists and our talented moderator, Rick Jackson, who will close out this event.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, League of Women Voters. That does bring this session to a conclusion. Again, everybody who registered will get emails telling you of all the links that we've mentioned throughout the night. We want to thank our guest again, Collin Marozzi of the ACLU Ohio, Mia Lewis of Common Cause, Citizens Redistricting Commission Co-Chair Greg Moore, and former League of Women Voters Director Carrie Davis for all your expertise and your willingness to share. The deadline we're all watching now, September 15th, but you need not wait to be involved. That's the message. You're involved just by being here. Keep that up. I'm Rick Jackson of Ideastream Public Media. Thanks for watching and have a great night.